In this course of lectures and discussions, my object is to give an overview of the first Roman emperors. There are several ways in which I can do this. I could take a purely narrative approach. I could borrow heavily from Suetonius, as supplemented by Tacitus and other historians. I could then explain how Augustus was born here, and that he died there, and that he may have been poisoned by his wife. Then I could say what awful things Tiberius did in his swimming pool, and how he had a fisherman thrown off a cliff. But he was eventually murdered by the head of the Praetorian Guard, and that was the end of him. We could take this approach, and to some extent we shall take that approach. Indeed, it would be a shame to pass over so many memorable stories. Even so, we can be more adventurous than that. There is the social structure of the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. This, I think, will be very interesting. Also, I think there is a lot to be said for doing something on the origins of Christianity, a religion, whether or not you believe it, but a religion of the utmost importance, which is still with us and which I have no doubt will be with us for a long time longer. I'm not suggesting that we should focus on the Gospels, not necessarily. I think it might be better to focus on the general circumstances of the Eastern Mediterranean during the 1st century. We could ask, for example, how alive were the various pagan religions? We could ask, how is it that St. Paul was able to wander all over the Eastern Mediterranean without once being knocked on the head by bandits? We could also ask why the Roman authorities were so hostile to Christianity, certainly from the time of Nero onwards. Before this, though, we could ask, why is it that the Romans were so nervous about the Jews? In short, why did the Romans do their best to keep the lid on things? And the answer to that has a lot to do with where Judea and Samaria and so forth were, and what they were close to. This will let us see that if Christ had been born in, shall we say, southern Spain, and that would put him roughly in the middle of nowhere, and if the local ruling class had gone to the governor and said, "This man is preaching rebellion," the local governor might well have said, "Yes, that's very sad, and I will do something about it, but it's lunchtime now, so let's all be very calm about this." Whereas, in fact, when the Sanhedrin went to Pilate and said, "This man is preaching rebellion," Pilate probably turned pale and thought, no, we can't have that. Because, you see, there is a very good geopolitical reason for why the Romans, when they were confronted by Christ, should have hit the panic button. So we can talk about that, and having said something about it, I think I will talk about it, though not at the moment. Let's pass to the slideshow for today. And here at the beginning is a picture of the first emperor, Augustus. Now, there is a credible case for arguing that Augustus was the second emperor, the first one being Julius Caesar. After all, Julius Caesar was the first man to set himself up as supreme ruler of Rome and the entire Roman world. You could easily say that Julius Caesar is the man who got the show on the road. But keeping with the performance image, you could easily say also that Julius Caesar was a one-off performance, that it was Augustus who was the first emperor. No doubt it was realized by everybody who mattered, or everybody who had a head on his shoulders, that after Augustus, or with Augustus, something fundamental had changed in the way that Rome and the Mediterranean world should be governed, and that the past was no longer any guide to the future. Whatever approach you take, we need to decide who exactly are the early emperors? Or rather, where do we draw the line? And there are various ways of looking at this question. What we can do, and perhaps what I may do, is to take all of the emperors who were related to Augustus. The nature of the relationship can be rather complex, and I will give you an imperial family tree somewhere in these slides. So we could take the emperors as Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. That's 5 of them, and they run between about 31 BC and 69 AD, and after that something else happens. But that would be a rather restrictive view of the matter. You can take the first 5 emperors, the Julio-Claudians. You can take these 5 emperors as a very important rough draft for everything else in Roman history that happens afterwards. But you could perhaps stretch a point and say that the early emperors run up until the death of Domitian in 98 AD. That can be taken as the end of the revolution. The fundamental change in the government of Rome and of the Mediterranean world, which was begun by Julius Caesar, is now complete. It is complete and it is plainly irrevocable. The autocracy was begun, perhaps by Julius Caesar, certainly by Augustus. It ran through another 4 emperors who were all related to Augustus and through him in some way to Julius Caesar. It then survived the end of the Julio-Claudian house. It survived the turmoil of 3 emperors in 1 year. It has now survived another dynasty, the Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. The autocracy is set in concrete. It is the Roman constitution, and from now on there will be no possible question of a return to republican government. The only question is how to ensure that the autocrat, the supreme ruler of Rome and the Mediterranean world, will be a man of competence and perhaps of goodness, and not an idiot and not a tyrant. Here then are the first 18 emperors, and these are reconstructions based on their surviving images. Obviously, wherever you want to draw the line, I will not be drawing the line at the end of these first 18, but it's worth looking at them. Some of these were men of undeniable greatness. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and possibly men like Trajan and Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius. These are undeniably great men. You can't dispute that these, particularly men like Julius Caesar and Augustus, you can't dispute that these were men of the highest political genius. That doesn't mean that they were particularly good men, but undeniably they were remarkable men. Indeed, if you look at someone like Caligula, he may be mad. It's hard to say anything for sure about his reign, because he is not particularly blessed with favourable historians. But it is possible to make a case for Caligula, and I will try to do that. Equally, Tiberius, a solid pair of hands. Even the most hostile historians never denied that, but a man with a somewhat shady reputation. Galba, look at him. You wouldn't want him as your line manager, would you? And you wouldn't really want him to be your absolute lord and master. And it seems that the Roman people took a good hard look at him and thought, next please. Or there's Nero. Nero is a difficult emperor to judge justly. He has been very unfortunate in his historians because he made some very important enemies. He had the whole of the senatorial aristocracy against him, because he killed so many of its members, and perhaps he killed many of them with good reason. He's also had the church against him for the very good reason that he is the first persecutor of the church. But it is possible to make a case for Nero, and one has been made in the past few centuries, and one has been made with increasing confidence during the past few centuries. Indeed, Nero appears to be attracting the Roman equivalent of the Richard III Society. And Domitian, another one like Tiberius, and a bit like Nero, unfortunate in his enemies, because it's his enemies who wrote the history, but even his most bitter enemies do accept that he did some useful things. So these are the first 18 emperors. You could stretch a point and say these are the 18 early emperors, though, as I said, I will not be covering all of these because I can't. But wherever you choose to draw the line, there is a question that needs to be answered. This is, what do these people matter to us? You have here a series of 18 striking images, but these people have all been dead for around 2,000 years, and so why are they of any particular importance to us? There are two answers to this question. The first is, they are important because they're interesting. All history stands on its own merits, and Roman history is particularly interesting, or at least I think it is, and the fact that you've chosen this course indicates that you think it's interesting. So it's important because it's interesting, and that could be the end of the answer. But a second answer is that these men are important because they are important. Without these men, without the Roman emperors, the Roman Empire would not have survived. The Roman Republic conquered most of the Mediterranean world, but for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes, it is very unlikely that, governed by republican institutions, Rome and its empire would have held together for any length of time. It is very likely, had the empire, or rather had the rule of the emperors not been established, that the Roman Empire, as conquered by the Roman Republic, would have disintegrated as quickly as the great empire conquered by Alexander the Great, or as quickly as the even greater empire conquered by Genghis Khan. It is because of the emperors, and in particular because of these first 18, or perhaps because of these first 5 men, that the Roman Empire, as it existed around the birth of Christ, continued to exist for 500 years afterwards. And indeed, if you take the Byzantine Empire as the medieval Roman Empire, the empire continued to exist for over 1,000 years after these men passed away. But let us confine ourselves to the 500 or so years after the birth of Christ, during which the empire was a solid, and for most of the people living in it, a permanent institution in Western Europe. It is because of the longevity and the apparent permanence of the Western Roman Empire that it can be taken as the foundation of our own civilization. Here, for example, is an image from, I think, the 15th century, and it represents the coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day 800. This is nearly 800 years after the death of Augustus, and here is Charlemagne, a German king, being crowned as the Roman Emperor. 800 years after the death of Augustus, perhaps 300 years after the disappearance of the Western Roman Empire. And here is someone whom the Pope thinks it worth crowning as a Roman Emperor. Coming forward 1,000 years from the coronation of Charlemagne, here is this wonderful painting by David. It's of Napoleon being crowned Emperor of the French in 1804. Or rather, nobody crowned Napoleon. Napoleon crowned himself. I think the Pope was brought in thinking that he would officiate, to do the same to Napoleon as Leo III had done to Charlemagne. But Napoleon had rather different ideas. He took the crown out of the Pope's hand right at the last minute and stuck it on his head himself. It turned out that the Pope was a spectator rather than a participant in the ceremony. But although this is a slight deviation from the established routine, the whole picture, look at it, it stinks of Rome. It's rich with Roman imagery. And so as recently as 1804, someone thought it worthwhile to legitimize his rule as a military dictator by wrapping himself, in this case literally, in the mantle of a Roman emperor. Then we can come a little closer to home. Here, I think, is a half-crown of George III, and here on the right there is, I think, a shilling of George II. Two kings of England, 18th century kings of England, kings in the Hanoverian line. Both of them chose to show themselves on their coins attired as Roman emperors. And this is how they showed themselves to their subjects. This is how their subjects, for the most part, saw them every day. And here at the bottom, you have a 2-shilling piece of our own dear Queen. And although she's not wearing a toga, she is wearing an olive wreath, which again is Roman imagery. I could say more, but we can take it that the Roman Empire continues to have a solid presence in our own daily lives. It is very unlikely, if you go around modern England, that you'll find any obvious reminder of the Egyptian pharaohs. But if you walk around the centre of any large city in this country, you will see reminder after reminder after reminder of the Roman Empire. To take an example at random, there's a bronze statue of James II outside the National Gallery, again dressed as a Roman emperor. But it doesn't matter. You can go anywhere in London, anywhere in any of the great cities in this country, and Rome is all around us. And because Rome is all around us, the emperors are all around us. Without getting into the politics of it, the European Union exists because it is a reconstruction of the Roman Empire. And there is a somewhat extended answer to the question of why these early emperors are important. Let me turn now to the question of why Rome was transformed from a republic into an empire. This is a super fast 45-second overview of the growth of Rome from a pifflingly small city-state or a pifflingly small hill fort on the banks of the Tiber to the mistress of the Mediterranean. And look at the way in which Rome grew. Notice the slow growth over many centuries. There we are. That takes us up to the death of Augustus in 14 AD. And notice what's happened in that 800-year fast forward. Rome starts, as I said, as an insignificantly small city-state in central Italy. It has no great geopolitical advantage. It's not like Alexandria or Constantinople. It is, as I said, an insignificantly small city-state, which in its early days may not even be worth dignifying as city-state. It was a hill fort or a collection of hill forts. It then steadily expands, taking over first of all of its neighbours who spoke Latin as their language, and then expanding to take over those areas that spoke Etruscan, moving then steadily into southern Italy where people spoke Greek, eventually unifying all Italy south of the Po as a sort of centralised state with its capital in Rome. But then it doesn't stop. The Romans find that they take over Sicily, and then Corsica and Sardinia, and then a chunk of Spain, and then more of Spain, and then the whole of North Africa, and then they find themselves in Greece, taking over bits here and bits there, moving into Asia, into the territory of modern Turkey, conquering the whole of France in just 10 years, and then still expanding, taking over Egypt, taking over the deep hinterland of the northern Mediterranean, going all the way up by AD 14 to the Rhine and the Danube. And all of this time, until about 100 BC, Rome conquered and ruled these territories as a city-state with republican institutions. The problem was, and this is a problem which we thought we had addressed by the end of the 18th century, the problem was that it is very difficult to reconcile a republican or perhaps a free constitution with the government of a large empire. If you are, let's say, the Pharaoh of Egypt, or better than that, the King of Persia, you are an absolute despot. You are the master of the lives, liberties, and properties of all your subjects. If you decide to conquer another territory, or if another territory drops into your lap, it's pretty easy to incorporate that into the existing order of things. You just send another of your friends out to rule it. If you are the citizen of a free community and you find that you have a large and growing empire, there is a problem of how to govern this empire. And the Romans, for all their political genius when it came to the constitution of their republic, chose a very poor way of governing their empire. You are the citizen of a republic, you have certain rights as a free citizen, and yet you are ruling over very large numbers of non-citizens. How do you reconcile these facts? The Romans chose a very inefficient way of doing it. You get yourself elected as a consul or one of the other magistrates in Rome. Your historic function is to lead armies into battle, to sit in judgment, to convene the Senate and preside over its sessions, to do that for 1 year at a time. Then your term of office comes to an end. Before Rome became an empire, you would withdraw to manage your farm, or you would take up a seat in the Senate, or you would do both. But as soon as Rome became an imperial republic, the custom emerged whereby you served out your term of office as a consul or a praetor or whatever, and then you were assigned a province to govern. You might be given a little patch of territory in northern Italy. You'd go and spend a year there, settling disputes over the ownership of pigs, and then come back, and that doesn't have much effect on the overall structure of government of the Republic. Later on, you might be given the governorship of the whole of North Africa, or of a great chunk of Spain, or better than that, you might get given Greece, or a large part of modern Turkey. And then you would come back loaded with wealth, even if you didn't take bribes, even if you didn't deliberately despoil the provincials. It was very difficult to come back from governing one of those territories without having picked up 4 or 5 lifetimes worth of income. Since the Republican magistracies were now the gateway to fabulous enrichment, it meant that getting yourself elected as a consul or getting yourself elected to some other Republican office became more than a matter of family pride or public spirit. It became a matter of life or death importance. Your actual performance of your duties in Rome was entirely secondary to your long afterlife as the governor of Spain or of Greece or of a large part of modern Turkey. And this meant that the Republican constitution became unbalanced. There were other reasons, but it's possible to talk at enormous length about the unbalancing of the Roman constitution. Just take it that by about 100 BC, it was entirely obvious to anyone with half a brain that the Republican constitution, which had served Rome very well for many centuries, was no longer working. Roman politics had become one long street battle in which families of super rich aristocrats competed for electoral office, in which they could throw vast amounts of money. Even by modern standards, unbelievably large amounts of money could be thrown into the business of winning elections in Rome. And so you have electoral corruption, you have street battles, you have the almost routine murder of political opponents, and you have all of this overseen by a fiercely competitive clique of super rich aristocrats who are desperate to secure those Republican magistracies, not, as I said, through family pride or public spirit, but because these magistracies are the prelude to 1 or 3 or 5 years of massive enrichment. The Republican constitution breaks down. It's necessary to move to another style of government, one which takes into account that Rome is not just a city-state with dependencies, but that it is the capital of an empire which covers most, or indeed later on, all of the Mediterranean shoreline. A question about the corrupting effects of the loot from Carthage. It wasn't so much the Carthaginian indemnities that brought the money into Rome. It was the fact that Rome was now the greatest naval and indeed military power in the Mediterranean world. All of the Greek kings in the East, instead of going to war with each other, now sent teams of ambassadors to Rome to bribe the Senate into saying Cyprus belongs to Egypt. No, it doesn't. It belongs to Syria, and so on, backwards and forwards. But it was the immense wealth of the Roman upper classes, which grew very suddenly after the Second Punic War. It's that which destabilized the constitution and made the constitution towards the end completely unworkable. The only logical solution to this problem was autocracy. It was to have one man in charge who would reconcile all of the competing interests. One man above the political fray who would have no particular allegiance to any of the competing groups, who would make sure that the Roman poor were treated with their due respect, who would make sure that great wealth was protected, though also making sure that great wealth was enjoyed responsibly, and who would also ensure that the provincials themselves, the great majority of the Mediterranean population, had some consideration paid to their interests. This is not something that could be done by any hereditary body in Rome, and it couldn't be done by any elected magistrates or representative bodies. It is something that could only be done by a single man, a boss, or a king. The problem was that whereas most of the Mediterranean population was quite happy to have a king, indeed they were very happy to worship their kings as gods, if that's what the kings wanted, the Romans themselves, and most of the Italians, regarded the very word king with horror. It's rather as if you were to suggest that America should get itself a king and an hereditary House of Lords. They would, of course, laugh at you, or they might pat you on the head saying, that's a bright idea, isn't it? But we've got our constitution. But if you persisted, if you were quite serious about imposing an hereditary monarch on the Americans, they would probably begin to feel uncomfortable and then outraged. They are the free citizens of a republic. There is nobody who stands above them. They have a president, they have senators, they have judges in the Supreme Court, but these are people who draw their respect from the offices they fill, and they fill those offices for a limited time, and when they cease to fill those offices, they will return to ordinary life and be equal to all other Americans. At least that's the principle of it. They would be scandalized if anyone seriously recommended a monarchy. And that is how the Romans regarded the idea of a king, and the Italians as well. And although you might say, well, do the Roman people matter? They're a minority, a very small minority of the population of the empire. And the answer is, yes, the Roman people do matter, because it is from the Roman people that the entire ruling class of the empire is drawn. All of the generals, all of the governors, all of the people generally in charge are from Rome or from Italy. Their prejudices are of the greatest importance. It may be that if you manage to establish a monarchy, that after a few generations you'd have widened the pool of recruitment for senior administrators and generals across the empire as a whole, and the Greeks and Syrians and Egyptians who are now filling the administration, they're much more comfortable with the idea of a monarchy. But at the outset, you are dealing with governing institutions which are entirely populated by Romans or Italians, and these people are resolute that they don't want a monarchy. The peace of the Mediterranean world requires a monarchy. The prejudices of the Roman or the Italian peoples prevent a monarchy from being established. By the late 40s BC, however, Julius Caesar has become the ruler of the entire Mediterranean world, and he puts an end to the civil wars, and he starts sorting out all of the unfinished business that has been laid aside during the past 60 or 80 years because of various political disputes and the occasional civil war. His problem is that he is never able to regularize his power. He is dictator for life. He is Pontifex Maximus. He can be a consul whenever he wants. He is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now that's enough to keep Caesar in power for the rest of his life, but he's in his 50s, he's not in the best health. In 10 years' time, everyone agrees he probably won't be around, and the question is, what then? The arguments raged backwards and forwards. Some people said that Caesar should simply be declared king of the Roman Empire. The Roman people let up a great wail of horror at that suggestion. Others suggested, all right, dictator for life in Italy, but outside Italy, king, and that still wasn't good enough. Then word went round that Caesar was thinking of transferring the capital from Rome to Alexandria in Egypt, from where he could rule as king or pharaoh or Almighty God himself if he so chose. And that didn't go down very well. And then in 44 BC, he's murdered. Murdered by some very bad, or at the very least by some very stupid men, in my view. But the point is, he's murdered, and that is the end of Rome's first experiment with dictatorship for life. But the logic doesn't allow things to end there. After Caesar's death, the question is what to do next. Some people, Cicero for example, Brutus and Cassius, the assassins, not that Cicero was one of the assassins, but there were many people who said Caesar's rule was a rather eccentric interlude in the history of our great republic, and now that he's dead, we should return to full republican government, election of magistrates, the meeting of the Senate, and that the Roman people, through its historic institutions, should resume their sovereignty. But there were many other people who said, no, that's over. It can't be brought back. It's finished. We need to move on. You've murdered Caesar, and so I think we need to look for a replacement. Various people who fancied themselves as replacements, possibly Mark Antony, Caesar's good friend and fellow consul. He doubtless thought that he could step straight into Caesar's shoes. Indeed he did. He wasn't in the Senate House when Caesar was murdered. He'd been taken aside by some of the conspirators and kept out of sight, so he couldn't do anything to protect Caesar. But after the assassination, Mark Antony hurried straight off to Caesar's house, seized all his papers, laid hands on all his money, and then a few days afterwards, Antony took control of Caesar's party by giving that speech in the forum for the funeral. So Mark Antony, a man in his late 30s, an experienced general, an experienced politician, someone who is eminently qualified to step into Caesar's shoes, or who seems eminently qualified, he seems the most likely replacement, except that although Caesar doesn't have any legitimate children alive, he has a son by Cleopatra, but he's half Greek and in Egypt. Although Caesar has no legitimate children, he does have a great nephew. His sister's daughter had married Gaius Octavius, a solid and moderately wealthy man from outside Rome, about 20 miles to the southwest of Rome, the town of Nola. Not a man of great distinction. His family is not terribly distinguished. It's old. It is solidly rich without being immensely rich. They have a son, Gaius Octavius, born in 63 BC. He is Julius Caesar's great nephew. For reasons that we don't understand, in 45 BC in September, when Caesar is back in Rome as supreme master of the Roman world, he drafts his last will, in which he adopts his great-nephew Octavian as his heir, someone to have 3/4 of his estate and who is to be regarded as Caesar's adoptive son. We don't know why Caesar did this, but he did. When Caesar was murdered, Octavius was in Macedonia. He was waiting for Caesar because the idea was that Caesar would tie up any last business in Rome. He would then set out for Greece and Macedonia, cross into Asia, and then lead a large-scale campaign against the Parthians. And Octavian was waiting there for further instructions. He was waiting for Caesar to turn up, where they would join together. Instead, he gets news that Caesar's been murdered, and he's the heir in the will. And so Octavian hurries back to Rome, arrives on the 6th of May 44 BC. He's only 19. He goes up to various important people and says, I am Octavian, I am Caesar's heir. Antony laughs out loud, saying, you're just a boy with a famous name, go away, I'll give you some money, but go away, leave this to men. He's taken up by Cicero, a very shifty politician who thinks that he can use Octavian, Caesar's great nephew, obviously with some legitimacy among the soldiers, as a way of advancing his own interests in politics. But although Octavian is only 19, although he has no military experience and no political experience, he is a most remarkable 19-year-old. He soon makes it clear that he's a power in his own right. He first of all gets into dispute with Mark Antony. We don't need to go through the details of this dispute because they go on and on, but there is a brief civil war between Octavian, backed by Cicero, and Mark Antony. Octavian wins by accident, goes back to Rome and says, I want to be the consul, and it looks as though there will be a full-scale civil war between Antony and Octavian, but they soon realise that their interests do largely coincide. In November 43 BC, Octavian and Antony and Lepidus, they need someone to balance this coalition. They meet in Bologna in northern Italy and they agree to what's called the Second Triumvirate, which means that they divide up the Roman world among themselves. You get this, you get that, you get whatever. The first object of our coalition will be to hunt down and punish all the men who killed Caesar, which pleased Octavian no end. The second agreement was, well, we need some money, because Antony, being rather spendthrift, had managed to dissipate the whole of Caesar's fortune, and so these are the sole masters of the Roman world, or so they regard themselves, but they're rather short of cash. So they agree to have a purge. They drop a death list, 300 senators, 2,000 members of the lesser aristocracy, publish the names. Anyone who brings in the head of this person gets a share of the fortune, but the rest of it's confiscated to us. They fill up their cash bags with loot gained in what by now had become the normal way. They decide to go east and to hunt down and to kill all of Caesar's assassins, which they do with great efficiency. And I won't talk about the last of those civil wars. What matters is that after the assassins have been punished, the Roman world is divided between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Lepidus fades out of the picture. I won't discuss him. He dies of old age, but Octavian makes sure that he's a man of no authority. The Roman world is divided between Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Antony needs soldiers and money because he's fighting a war with the Parthians, and the person with the money and the soldiers is Queen Cleopatra VII. So Antony moves his headquarters to Alexandria. He then marries Cleopatra and begins to rule the East as part of a divine right partnership. And he even starts dividing the empire into zones to be given to Cleopatra's children. Octavian is waiting for his moment. He waits for Antony to go just a bit too far, and then he declares war. He doesn't declare war on Antony, he declares war on Cleopatra rather, announcing that she is a danger to the empire, and indeed she's ready to invade Italy, which is true. The war goes well for Octavian. He wins the great battle at Actium in September 31 BC. 11 months later, he turns up in Alexandria. He spent the previous year travelling around the eastern provinces of the empire, securing them for himself. He turns up in Alexandria. Cleopatra hopes that she can negotiate some kind of settlement, but Octavian is resolute. Egypt will now be Roman territory. Cleopatra is a prisoner. Antony commits suicide, and of course Cleopatra commits suicide. She gets herself bitten by that snake. And that is the end of the Civil War. The question is, what next? It's taken 15 years. To 30 BC from 44 BC is 14 years, forgive me. In 44 BC, Caesar was the supreme sole ruler of the Mediterranean world. He was then murdered, and you have 15 years of divided rule. But now, in 30 BC, Octavian finds himself in exactly the same position as Julius Caesar, but it's a much better position because everyone who could stand seriously in his way is now dead. Time has moved on. The number of men who can remember the Republic when it was a functioning institution, that's a dwindling minority. People didn't live much beyond their 50s in those days, so time went by very quickly. Octavian is now in the same shoes as Caesar had occupied. The question is, how is he going to fill those shoes, and how is he going to do it for the rest of his life, and make sure that after he's dead, somebody else fills those same shoes? There is where the political genius comes in. Octavian is the richest man in the Mediterranean world. He still has some of the money he's confiscated, but he's now the pharaoh of Egypt, because when he took over Egypt, he didn't say, this is now a Roman province and will be governed in the same way as all the other provinces. No, he took over Egypt as his own personal possession. As far as the Egyptians were concerned, he was the pharaoh. All of the Egyptian taxes were paid to him. All of the officials in Egypt looked to him as their supreme head. He is the richest man in the Mediterranean world. He's also commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He still happens to be, in the formal sense, a dictator for settling the emergency. And the question is, how do you crystallize all of this power? Because Octavian can do anything he wants. Nobody will stand up and say, you can't do this. He is the dictator. He is the ruler. But he wants to go beyond this. He wants to make sure that when he's no longer around, somebody else, one of his people, takes over. How do you cash in the chips that you've won in the succession of civil wars and turn them into a nice solid gold crown that you can put on your head? Caesar was never able to solve that problem, but then again he didn't have time to solve it. Octavian does solve it, partly because he is a genius, a greater political genius than Caesar, also because everyone who could seriously object to his solution is dead, but also because he does have more time than Caesar. He's in his 30s. And the solution is this. In 27 BC, Octavian is the consul. He's one of the consuls for the year. He calls a meeting of the Senate and he says, I have been in charge for 15 years at least. But that was during the long emergency following the assassination of my great uncle. I have now brought peace to the entire Mediterranean world. The emergency that justified my supreme powers is now over. Therefore, I am going to resign all of the unusual powers I hold, and I will become an ordinary Roman citizen. Whether the outbreak of horror that followed this announcement was spontaneous or coordinated is of no importance whatever. It was probably a combination of both. But the senators hurry forward with a series of compromise proposals, a 10-year continuation of rule over all the provinces where armies are stationed. He takes the titles of princeps and Augustus, or Augustus rather, and the title of father of the country, and the month of Sextilis is renamed August. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but it is an official endorsement of his continuing rule. And then, 3 years later, Augustus is seriously ill, and after he recovers, he imposes a new settlement. He's sick of being a consul every year. There are normally 2 consuls, and you see if he's one of the consuls, it means there are many other people who fancy the office, but they can't get it because there's only 1 vacancy a year instead of 2. He says that he'd like to be a sort of 3rd consul, He'll have all the powers of consul, but he won't actually occupy the office, which frees up 2 vacancies every year. He will sit beside the consuls in the Senate. He can call meetings of the Senate, and he has the right to make first proposals and speeches. He moves towards the tribunal power as the basis of his authority. He can grant amnesty to anyone accused of a crime. He can propose laws. He can veto laws. A very useful set of powers. There's a further distinction between the provinces of the empire ruled by the Senate and those ruled by Augustus, we should call him. So the red provinces have large armies stationed in them, or they have rather live borders, difficult borders. So the Senate gets Italy, Greece, western and northern Turkey, and parts of North Africa. Augustus gets Spain, France, the Balkans, Syria and Egypt. He is directly in charge of the red areas. He is in charge of the armies there. He appoints the officials. Everybody reports to him. The blue areas, those are senatorial provinces, and they are supposedly ruled in the traditional manner. Somebody occupies an office in Rome, the office expires, and so he's sent out to govern one of these areas. But in practice it makes no difference, because Augustus just nominates everybody. If you want to be a consul, you don't have to go giving speeches to the people anymore. You just go to Augustus and say, I really would like to be the consul. Can I be consul the year after next? And if Augustus is in a good mood and he owes you a favour, or he owes your father a favour, yes, you can be the consul. And then the speech giving and the voting is a formality. So, Augustus has done it. He's done what Caesar couldn't do, or what Caesar didn't have time to do. He never takes on the title of king. If anyone was to suggest, oh, Augustus, you are the king, he would have said, no, I'm not the king. I am simply the first citizen of the Republic. I'll have no talk of kingship. No crown, no crowds of eunuchs, no need for people to prostrate themselves on the ground and bang their head 3 times on a carpet. Nothing like that. None of the outward trappings of monarchy. He is simply Augustus. He is the princeps. He is the imperator, the leader. He is various things. He's not a king. He also doesn't hold any rather dodgy legal offices. Caesar legitimized himself with the title of dictator, and then the unusual title of dictator for life. Dictator is a recognized office in the Roman constitution, but Augustus resigns that. He says, no more dictatorship, the emergency is over. And so he fashions out of the rubble of the Roman Republic a new constitution in which he is at the undisputed head. He is the undisputed head of this new structure, but it's possible to look at the result and say, he has indeed restored the Republic. The Senate continues to meet, there are consuls, there are tribunes, there are praetors. Everything appears to be working just as it did. I grant that Augustus is now the first citizen, but he's still a citizen, he's just one of us. And Augustus played along with it. He didn't go about Rome surrounded by bodyguards. He would walk around the forum in a toga like everybody else, slapping people on the back and shaking hands, and being everybody's jolly uncle, which is a remarkable act, because Augustus was an extraordinarily unpleasant young man. And have a look at this. First of all, when financing the second triumvirate, he willingly agrees to the murder of 300 rich senators and 2,000 other members of the nobility, including his own very good friend Cicero. The story afterwards is that he wouldn't agree for 3 days to this, but, well, he did agree to it, there's no doubt of that. In 36 BC, he defeated Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey the Great, who had been governing Sicily for a long time. Sextus had recruited his army from runaway slaves. Augustus handed 30,000 of these captured slaves back to their masters. Those whose masters couldn't be identified, he simply had crucified. He had 6,000 men crucified, all on the same day, in the same place, and didn't care about it. There is a story that even when he was quite old and an emperor, a slave boy accidentally wrung the neck of a chicken that he regarded as a pet. He was so angry that he had the boy crucified. You're talking about someone who is ruthless. In 30 BC, his own relative, Caesar's only legitimate son, Caesarion, the son of Caesar and Cleopatra, he's 17, and he's no particular danger. When Octavian turns up in Egypt, Cleopatra's last act is to get Caesarion out of Egypt, sending him off to India, anywhere where he can be safe. He doesn't get very far. Octavian finds out where he's going, waylays him, and has him put to death. And the words were, "There's only room in this world for one Caesar." If you get seriously in Octavian's way, he will look at you with his cold, unblinking eyes, and he'll have you put to death. He won't do it like your standard sadist. He won't laugh and enjoy watching you writhe around in torment. No, he doesn't do that. He'll just have you killed, and then he'll put you out of his mind. That's one more tick on the list of things to do before you take supreme power. But once he had killed everyone who mattered, he then put a smile on his face, and as I said, turned into everyone's jolly uncle. He cultivated a reputation for moderation and clemency. And again, this helped to reconcile people to the fact of his government. Now, what else reconciles people? There is the fact that everybody gets something. The first thing that people get, well, the first thing the provincials get is honest government, or reasonably honest government, more honest government than they'd ever had in the past. There's a picture I often use. You all know that one, don't you? Pontius Pilate washing his hands when a particular prisoner is taken before him. Pilate is not a great advertisement for the government of the provinces. He is corrupt, he is tyrannical, and he is incompetent. And he gets seriously on the nerves of the Jewish upper classes in Judea. But eventually they write a letter of complaint. They make a formal complaint to the emperor in Rome, who is Tiberius, pointing out all the wicked and useless things that Pilate has done. Pilate is immediately recalled to Rome to face charges of corruption and maladministration. He and Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest whom Pilate has appointed. What happens to them after this is lost to us. Some people say that he was forced to commit suicide in Rome, others that he was exiled to Gaul. The Ethiopian church claims that he settled with his wife in Ethiopia and became a Christian and was martyred. And we don't know what happened to Pilate, but there is no doubt that after a strongly worded letter from the leading provincials to the emperor, he was immediately recalled and charged with various serious criminal offences. You couldn't do this under the Republic. In the Republic, a governor was sent out, and he had absolute power for the length of his time in charge. And there was a court in Rome which would listen to complaints from the provincials, but for the most part, this court was run by the friends and relatives of the ex-governor, and so you wouldn't get justice. What the emperors established was a regular scheme of inspection and control over the provinces. And this is something that the provincials do appreciate. If you read through Suetonius, the great biographer of the emperors, you'll think Rome is a continual freak show. You've got frequently insane emperors and mostly tyrannical emperors, how on earth does this system hold together? And the answer is this. If Nero wanted to have his favourite boy slave castrated and made into his wife, and if Caligula wanted to name his horse as one of the consuls, and if Tiberius had his swimming pool on Capri and decided to murder 50 senators, that was what the emperor did in Rome. If you are a merchant in Alexandria or Antioch or just a hill farmer in central Turkey, it doesn't matter to you what the emperor's doing in Rome. What matters is that life and property are firmly and efficiently protected in your part of the empire, and your life is stable and predictable. You will not have an army suddenly turning up and saying, there's another civil war, so we're going to take all of your sheep because, well, we've got to feed our soldiers. And if you've got any money, we'll have that as well. Oh, and do consider yourself my slave. I'll use you for building fortifications. And if it really suits my convenience, I'll sell you to somebody. There's no more of that. What you've got is regular, honest and reasonably cheap government, and it's something I'll develop in more detail later on. In late Republican times, the roads around Rome itself were so dangerous that even during the day, rich people only dared set out on a journey with an armed guard, sometimes of several hundred men, whereas later on, after about 70 years of imperial government, St. Paul was able to spend 20 years wandering through Asia Minor, wandering through the territory of modern Turkey and Greece, walking from Smyrna to Ephesus, and from Byzantium to Thessalonica, and then down to Corinth, walking along those very long roads. And never once did he fall among thieves. Never once were he and his friends pounced on by bandits and taken prisoner. And this is what the emperor represented to the provincials. It doesn't matter what he does in Rome. If he wants to declare himself a god, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that your part of the world is at peace and honestly and cheaply administered. And that's what the emperors gave to the provinces. And then there's the expansion of the citizenship. In 69 BC, there were 910,000 citizens. By 28 BC, that's gone up to 4 million. And by 14 AD, it's pushing towards 5 million. These figures are contested. Some people say you can't trust any figures from the ancient world. Other people say the basis of counting changed between 69 and 28. Now, maybe some truth in that. But it's also highly likely that the number of citizens did greatly expand, and it expanded largely because Julius Caesar and then Augustus were lavish with their grants of citizenship to the provincials. Here is a bit from Acts of the Apostles. St. Paul is preaching in Jerusalem, and the Sadducees, who don't believe in the resurrection, they don't believe in a resurrection, turn up, and there's a street brawl. The Roman army rushes in because this is a part of the world where you don't allow street brawls to go too far. The centurion says, right, strip those people naked. I want them all tied up and flogged. I'll have none of this. I'll have no trouble in my bit of this city. And St. Paul sidles up to him and says, excuse me, dear captain, but you do know that I'm a Roman citizen, don't you? And the centurion steps back saying, oh, Roman citizen, eh? Well, you can't have a Roman citizen tied up and flogged, and you certainly can't kill a Roman citizen. Roman citizens have certain legal rights, and ultimately they can appeal to the emperor for justice. Immediately the centurion sets Paul aside and sends him off to Festus, the governor of Syria, who is having dinner with, I think, Herod Antipas. And if you've read Acts of the Apostles, you know what happens next. The important point is that the number of citizens expands, and citizenship is something well worth having. Indeed, citizenship is something so well worth having that there appears to be a device whereby a non-citizen could sell himself into slavery. He could become the slave of a citizen. He would then be immediately freed, and he would acquire Roman citizenship. It sounds a rather iffy legal process, but you can imagine that it would have been surrounded by all manner of legal constraints. Everyone wanted to be a Roman citizen, and the emperors were increasingly willing to accommodate that wish. Later on, when we talk about Nero, one of the most significant things of his reign was his tour of Greece, where he scattered out grants of citizenship like confetti. And this was not just some bizarre whim of a madman. This was settled imperial policy, and it continued right the way through to 212 AD, when the Emperor Caracalla published a decree saying every free-born inhabitant of the empire is now a Roman citizen. This is something which the early emperors were working towards, Julius Caesar and Augustus among them. The Republic has not been abolished, it's simply been pickled and put in a jar on display. There are 2 consuls every year. There are the required number of tribunes. All the other republican offices continue to function, and these are keenly sought after by members of the senatorial aristocracy. All laws are made in the name of the Roman people. There is no king. There is no supreme person at the head of things, at least officially. It is possible to look at this and say, the Republic's been restored. But of course, the reality is that all power is now in the hands of Augustus. His power rests on an institutional basis that can be detached from him and in due course transferred to somebody else. He has achieved what Caesar didn't do, or perhaps couldn't do. Although the Republican institutions continue to work, they have largely been deactivated. Real power is in the hands of Augustus, and real administrative power is in the hands of the freedmen and slaves of his own household, who are given management jobs. They are the core of the imperial bureaucracy. That's what happens. The Senate continues to meet. The Senate is filled with very rich men, often from very old families, and Augustus will defer to the Senate. He'll speak to them with the greatest of respect, and as senators walk past, he will stand up. But the Senate itself is a rubber stamp, doing whatever the emperor advises. You've got propaganda for the illiterate masses, you've got coins, pictures, statues. Augustus's image is everywhere. In the eastern part of the empire, he is now worshipped as a living god. In the west, he's regarded as not far short of that. Oh, there's some of the stuff that was built during Augustus's reign. Foreign affairs and expansion. Julius Caesar had the idea of conquering Parthia, but Augustus's idea was the empire is quite big enough. The Rhine, the Danube, the Sahara Desert, and the Euphrates, those are our natural boundaries. Britain is on the list of places to take in due course, but not in my time. So the empire achieves something like its final shape during Augustus's reign, and the Parthians are no longer regarded as an irritation in the east that must be conquered like everybody else. It is an alternative empire which must be lived with in various ways. So Augustus runs a rather pacific foreign policy, and this allows him to disband large parts of the Roman army. He reduces it from 60 legions to 28 legions, about 120,000 men whose job is to guard these extraordinarily long frontiers. And the way you guard those frontiers is by making sure that you stay at peace. And now we come to the question of the succession. And this is all very controversial. Has anyone read or perhaps watched I, Claudius? That's based very much on the imperial biographies of Suetonius, and I've put a good translation of those onto the classroom. This is his wife, Livia. She is the empress. She is the co-ruler of the Roman world. She does much of the day-to-day administration. The family relationship is rather complex. Look, there's the imperial family tree. I'm not taking you through that today. I'll discuss it next week, but you can see that it is a little tangled in places. What matters is this. When Augustus marries Livia, she already has one son, Tiberius, by a previous marriage, and she's pregnant with a son from her previous husband. She comes into Augustus's household with two sons, one born, one in the womb. Augustus himself has a daughter, Julia, by a previous marriage. He marries Julia, first of all to his friend Marcellus, who dies. He then marries her to his very good friend and general, Agrippa, and they have several children. Two of them, Gaius and Lucius, Augustus adopts as his grandchildren, and the idea is that these will take over after his death. But then everybody dies. Agrippa dies suddenly, and Gaius and Lucius, who are barely into their 20s, they die suddenly within a few years of each other. Everyone Augustus keeps pointing to, saying, he'll be my successor, he dies as well, until the only person left who isn't dead is Tiberius, Livia's eldest son by her previous husband. And the suspicion at the time and ever since has been that Livia simply had them poisoned. She looks well up to poisoning everyone in sight, and the claim is that she did. As Augustus gets older and older, and weaker, he relies more and more on his stepson Tiberius, and eventually, in extreme old age, in 14 AD, Augustus dies in Nola, apparently in the bedroom where his father had died many years before. Again, the claim is that Livia had him murdered. The story is that Augustus realized that his wife was a notorious murderess, and he was frightened of her towards the end, and so he stopped eating anything. He decided that he would eat nothing but fruit that he'd picked himself, and so she sent a slave into the garden to paint one of the metallic poisons on all the figs on a tree, and Augustus picked a fig, ate it, and that was the end of him. That's the story, but whether it's true or just malicious gossip is something that it's up to you to believe. But what does matter is this. In 14 AD, Augustus dies, and he has outlived everyone from the generation who'd seen the death of Julius Caesar. There is almost nobody left alive who can remember the Republic in any possible sense. Most people have lived their entire lives during the reign of Augustus. It is absolutely unquestioned that once Augustus dies, his stepson and nominated heir Tiberius should step into his shoes. And that is what happens. When Julius Caesar had his funeral, this was attended by wild rioting. Mark Antony whipped the crowd up to white-hot fury with his speech, and the mob ran around Rome, grabbing hold of the conspirators or anyone they suspected of being one of the conspirators and ripping them to pieces. Whereas when Augustus died, the Senate and half the Roman population turned out to watch his coffin being carried from Nola to Rome. The coffin was carried peaceably into the Forum. There was the traditional cremation and the interment of the ashes in a tomb that Augustus had built some years earlier. And then, in complete peace, the Senate deliberates and negotiates with Tiberius over the terms of the transfer of power. The Republic is dead, Rome is now an empire, and the only question is, who shall be the emperor and what kind of government will he give to the Roman world? And the answer is, for the first few centuries, if you leave aside a few burps like Caligula, the emperors give the Roman world remarkably good government, very good government by all standards except those that we would now regard as acceptable. That is the beginning of the empire, and that is a very brief overview of the first and perhaps the greatest of all of those emperors. Next week, what I may do is to talk about Tiberius, but as I sit talking, I realise that I shouldn't do that at all. What I should do next week is put aside the emperors for a little bit and look at the empire as a whole. What kind of people lived in the empire? What did they believe? What did they expect? How was the empire governed? How were the taxes imposed and collected? Things like that. I'll talk about the general structure of the empire in the 1st century AD. How does that sound? Now, I've gone on, and I apologise for that. Can I ask you to hold questions over to next week? I would like to start by answering questions. Was that all right?